this is Alex from Black Sheep IT Consulting. Today I would like to shed some light on a recent demo I did, and I was asked to demonstrate the ability of Siebel CRM to execute a workflow process in a different, process space, that is, as an job or asynchronous server request. Now, my first thought was, okay, there is a business service called Asynchronous Server Requests. So I dug this out here of the Siebel repository. And Asynchronous Server Requests allows me to have a submit request method, and that method has various input arguments, which, if you look closely, are exactly what you put in a component request or a job in the Siebel view. Now let's quickly go there where we would manually enter a component request. So here you have, I have some test cases here which you can see, but you can manually enter this stuff. So you can create a new job, look for the component you want to run, such as Workflow Process Manager, which is the ideal choice if you want to run workflow processes. And then there is a mode which is set to asynchronous by default. So I've just created a new record. So asynchronous is actually the default behavior. What does asynchronous mean in this perspective? Asynchronous means that, the job is picked up at any time after saving the record by the server request broker, by the way, and then it will be forwarded to the respective component on either the specified, the requested server, or any server where the component is available. So this is also part of my demo, where I was asked to demonstrate the ability of Siebel to distribute the load evenly across servers, aka load balancing. So this happens more or less automatically if you omit the requested server and you have the component online on more than one server. So just like an object manager. And Workflow Process Manager is just a specialized object manager, really. So yes, you can manually enter and submit these jobs, and they will be picked up if the component is online or when it comes online, and the result will be the workflow that you sent in or specified as an input argument will be executed in a Workflow Process Manager session, not within the user session. So that's the whole point of the demo, asynchronously running a workflow process without interfering with the user session. So back to the Asynchronous Server Requests business service. That seems like the ideal choice. I can set up this job. It says asynchronous on the package, so it will create an asynchronous request. If you look at the user properties of that service, there's a mode user property, just says direct DB, which is a funny name for, put it in the database, it will be picked up, more or less. So if you compare that with the Synchronous Server Requests business service, which also exists, but is not what we want in this scenario, it has mode set to sync, so it will be immediately executed, and the caller will have to wait until, the response is returned, which is all the point about synchronous. You want to invoke something, wait until it's completed, and check for the outcome, error or not. There's also quite an interesting collection of, let's call it this class, SRM service. There's one more, Workflow Process Manager Server Request. So this one is kind of pre-built to execute a, workflow process, obviously. So it is hard-coded for the Workflow Process Manager component, but it's also hard-coded for synchronous execution. So not a good choice if you want to asynchronously execute workflow processes. Okay, so we have made our choice. This is the business service we want to invoke. But of course, I could invoke that business service and it would get me there. But I want to wrap it all in a workflow process itself to make things a little bit more generic. And so I was looking for how can I invoke this business service from a workflow process, which might sound counterintuitive, but it acts as a wrapper then, and you can pass in all kinds of input to the callee, to the workflow process that is invoked. So what I'm doing on a regular basis is look for inspiration by the good people at Siebel Systems or Oracle, which built, well, hundreds and hundreds of workflow processes that might use that business service. So how do you get there? Of course, this is what we love, the flat tab. And in the flat tab, I'm looking for workflow steps. And let's look for the Asynchronous Server Requests business service. And indeed, there are quite a few workflows in the standard repository. So the workflow name is somewhere here. Yeah, there's the parent workflow. So we have industry workflow processes for automotive or loyalty, which have been recently added in. So you have to run the repository upgrade if you're not upgrading recently. And these are for Siebel Loyalty for integration with CrowdTwist. And that's the one I created, by the way. So let's check out this loyalty contact CrowdTwist async flow. Let's check it out. So you go back to type. Let's find that guy. Okay, shouldn't be too complicated. Yes, it is. Well, it's not quite complicated. So here there is the Asynchronous Server Request business service with its glorious submit request method. So we can check out the input. So one input, of course, is the component you want to request, which is Workflow Process Manager. The other one is a little bit more elusive. It's a process property called inputs. Sorry, that's the property, inputs, but it's passed as the inputs input argument. So what is that? That is actually the input arguments for the workflow process we want to call. Okay, so probably the name of that workflow process that we want to asynchronously execute is somewhere in that inputs argument, which makes it a hierarchical argument. So indeed, inputs is a hierarchy process property. So that is an arbitrary property set. That is the property set that is passed in as the input property set to the workflow that is then invoked asynchronously. So that's the carrier or wrapper workflow. And it has a nice step to set the input arguments. So let's check out the first step. So set the input arguments uses the, well, quite useful workflow utilities service with its echo method. And the echo method here is used to put together the input property set for the callee. So we have in the input arguments, we specify INP, which is arbitrary really. So the echo method picks that up. And so we pass in inputs as INP, and inputs at this time is an empty property set. We take the object ID that we passed into the original to this carrier workflow, and we write it using dot notation, an interesting way to construct property sets, by the way. Using dot notation, write it to the object ID for the callee. And if you know how to invoke workflow processes, you need a process name, and this is hard-coded here. That's the workflow that will then be asynchronously invoked, which actually does the synchronization job with the CrowdTwist cloud application. So the output of this Well, the result of this is INP, a property set with two properties, object ID and process name, and it's passed on and saved as the inputs property set, which is then passed on to the inputs property set of the asynchronous server request business component submit request method along with the component name. Is there any output? Yes, the method has one output argument, request ID. So that's the row ID of the job of the component request, and that's just stored in that property, so it can be passed on. But that's all you get. You don't get was the workflow executed successfully or not, what's the output of the workflow or the business service. You would have to save that somewhere and pick it up later, or check on the outcome later, because it's asynchronous. All you get is the row ID of the job. So practically, if you get a request ID, it means, okay, we have accepted the job, saved it in the database, but we don't know if it has been executed yet or successfully so. So that's quite inspirational. It's good to know that the standard Siebel repository is populated with a lot of examples that you can leverage. What I do not like particularly about this workflow, it's that it hard codes the callee. What I have in mind is a carrier workflow that can run any other workflow, which sounds scary a little bit and is maybe insecure, but it's a demo. So the workflow I created is this one. I call it async workflow caller. And let's check it out. So this one, well, let's start with the major business service. It's asynchronous server request, all right, with submit request. And so I have an inputs property set, which I can pass in as a whole property set into the carrier workflow. I call it async payload just to distinguish, okay, this is the payload for the asynchronous process. I then set the component to workflow process manager. That's what I want. You could even soft code that one to run any component if you want a carrier workflow that does that. And the description of the job will be actually concatenated by a tag, a property I can enter. Then it's a hard-coded value created by this workflow, and this is the async process name. Now this is the name of the workflow process that was invoked, because I want to see in the description of the job what was going on. Because otherwise you just see a job for workflow process manager and you don't know, actually you can't see the input argument. So I want to elevate that a little bit. So in the input arguments for the workflow process, I have this async payload, which I specified as a hierarchical data type. So it's an arbitrary property set, any property set that is then expected by the callee. And there is this async process name process property, a string, which I have to populate. So the real process name I want, the asynchronous process name, is in here. I have to extract it. I had a bit of a hard time extracting it with the echo method. So I found solace by writing a quick custom business service that can extract a property of any given name and pass me back the value. So we can take a look at this one. And well, that's not very spectacular. So it has a get prop value method, and that really, well, gets the name of the property, and then from the first child, it returns the value of that property and sets it to property value. So it's really 3 lines of code, nothing spectacular here. It does the job for me. It was written faster than, well, trying meddling around with the echo method. So that is all to populate that async process name which is then just used in the description. So it's a luxury problem I'm facing here. I want that workflow process in the description. Okay, so that's actually not necessary to run the workflow. So all you would need was one step, literally. So I have this extra step just for the luxury of displaying stuff in the description of the job. All right. So now, of course, after looking at this workflow, the carrier workflow that can invoke any other workflow asynchronously, we want to see it in action. So here we go. I choose the business service simulator, a very trusty execution workbench, and simulator is truly the worst description of that view because it does not simulate, it runs it. So I'm using the workflow process manager business service to run the process. And the process I want to run, I have prepared an input file here, this one. So the process I want to run, I pass in as the process name to the run process method. That's my carrier or caller workflow. And I have a child property set called async payload. So that's the payload for the callee. And it carries an object ID. You could argue you take the object ID of the caller, but you pass in, that's the property set for the call to run the other workflow. So I have hard-coded a test object ID of an account. I'll show you the demo process I created. So this is a simple process that creates an activity for a given account, and it takes a description. So let's change that description to proper text, just today's date, so you can recognize it later. So that description will go into the callee workflow and will be passed into the activity. So, okay, before we call that, let's take a look at that demo workflow. Very simple one. So, yes, it uses a Siebel operation to create, insert an activity. It runs on the account business object. So the object ID will be the account, and it takes the description from a property INP description. Recognize that and passing that in the payload, and sets the type to administration. That's all it does. So what we expect is a new activity associated to the account we pass in as the object ID. Okay, let's look at that payload again one more time. So we have this account. This row ID will be passed to this process, which will run asynchronously. That's the whole point. And INP description will be passed on to the description field in the Siebel operation of that workflow. So this just demonstrates you can have any payload. You could have even hierarchical payload if you couple it together. Okay, so now let's run this one. So what do we get back? We get, well, it's a workflow process that ran. We have an instance ID, and we have a request ID, the row ID of a component request. And it has extracted the asynchronous process name from the payload. Okay, so let's check out the jobs. Here we go. And there is a job just run recently. Let's refresh that view, make sure that's the latest job. Successfully, it ran already. The workflow process manager is online on at least one server. Here's my description. So it was created by this workflow, and there's the BCRM demo was the payload workflow. That workflow was executed asynchronously on the workflow process manager business component. Let's see if it did its job correctly. So if I go back to my test account, I have it here, right? Let's look up the activities for that test account. And that activity, asynchronous workflow demo with today's date, has been created just all right. And notice it has been created asynchronously, so without interfering with the end user's session, running as a separate process. Okay, so we have a carrier workflow, this one. Just to reiterate, this is our carrier or caller workflow, which uses the Asynchronous Server Requests business service submit request, and it takes a hierarchical payload that it uses to execute the callee workflow. So the customer that I demoed this to was impressed with that. So with the ability of Siebel to execute any workflow asynchronously as a separate process. So that of course is good for scalability. And I have invoked it using the business service simulator. Right, so there's no magic in there. Of course, you could place a button somewhere or a runtime event inside Siebel. And in the demonstration, we also covered the REST API. So I thought it would be worthwhile to, well, let's go to the business process access view. This view is where you register workflow processes for a given responsibility or set of responsibilities. So they can be invoked by these responsibilities only, by users having these responsibilities. But at the same time, they can be invoked by the REST API, by a user who has this responsibility, very similar to the business service access. Now, this is 20.3 or later, where you have a workflow REST API. And so I have registered my carrier workflow here with the Siebel administrator responsibility. Nice enough. So now I can call it from the REST API. So let's open Postman. Let's see what we can get here. The first thing I get is a Swagger description, or later Siebel version you get OpenAPI 3.0 if you want. So I'm using the workflow API. That's the name of my workflow, my carrier workflow /describe. You get it, and there's the Swagger file. Now I've imported this in Postman, so I have a collection here, and that creates one example request for a post. And that is not the original one, so let me just open that in new tab. What Postman gives you, especially you're interested in the body. Let's remove that, don't need that one. And so you have the async payload as an object. So that must be a JSON object. And there's a tag. So I need async payload and the tag. The rest I don't need, really. So my request looks like this. The async payload is an object with the process name to execute. Now this one will not work. It's a demo. So that's my BCRM demo workflow. Let's pass in the same object ID. Let's pass in that input description. Need a comma there. So that is from Postman. And the tag is written to the job description. So also says Postman. So we know where this is coming from. So this is an external application making a REST call into Siebel, calling a workflow that then puts a request into the job queue, which is then hopefully executed. So let's run this baby. Okay, so we get a request ID back, the row ID of the job. This is the async process name it picked up. So time to look at the jobs again. Okay, let's refresh this one. So another successful run. We see the tag. So good information here in the description. It ran successfully. So our demo account should have a new activity. And there it is from Postman. So Postman did not create it, by the way, so that's maybe a little bit misleading. But the request to create an asynchronous server job to run the workflow that then puts in this description has come from Postman. Okay, so you can take this a long way, allowing external applications to place a workload into Siebel CRM as an asynchronous job that will then pick up and execute. And you might even think about, okay, saving this request ID and then have a data API on component requests, anything goes, and you come back a little bit later and check on the success or not as a batch or so. So very resource saving, I would say. All right. And there you have it. We have a carrier workflow that can execute any other workflow asynchronously. Thanks for watching. Take care and bye-bye.